We do not blame the lawlessness of an individual on a whole community.
We could go one way or the other, and we're going to go the wrong way if we keep taking in garbage into our country. Ilhan Omar is garbage.
At 6:03 a.m. near the University of Minnesota, the neighborhood was calm as students began their day. That calm did not last. The silence cracked under the low growl of federal engines rolling in from multiple directions, followed by coordinated movement that signaled this was not a patrol and not a check. Within minutes, agents moved through a nearby apartment complex, and the first discovery changed the tone of everything that followed. Inside the units closest to student housing, investigators located packaged heroin and fentanyl, stacks of cash, and firearms stored with clear intent rather than neglect. This moment forced a hard reset in how the scene was understood. It was not a small neighborhood drug bust that went too far. It was a coordinated federal infiltration designed to expose something already embedded and operating quietly. The evidence did not stand alone, and the way it was stored, moved, and protected pointed toward a system rather than an accident. As the scope widened, the stakes shifted with it. What began as a local enforcement action crossed into national security territory, raising alarms about how close organized networks had moved to everyday American life. Follow military power to see why this opening move was only the beginning of a much larger operation. The contrast inside the apartment complex was almost unsettling. Hallways remained still, doors closed, and overhead lights cast the same dull glow they did every morning, while outside the parking lot sat quiet and orderly, engines starting one by one as residents prepared to leave for work. Nothing in that calm suggested that a coordinated federal operation was already tightening around the building. The approach began without noise or urgency. Teams moved into position from multiple sides, sealing stairwells and securing exterior exits before anyone inside realized the perimeter had closed. Vehicles were placed with precision, blocking access points and preventing movement without drawing attention. Agents advanced floor by floor, not rushing, but not hesitating either, controlling each corridor before moving deeper. This was not a raid built for confrontation. It was designed to remove uncertainty. Entry came swiftly. Doors were opened under authority, rooms were cleared in sequence, and occupants were separated and secured without resistance. There was no exchange of gunfire, no frantic scrambling, only direct motion and short commands, the kind that reflects hours of rehearsal rather than improvisation. Within minutes, control of the space was complete, and the search phase began. The first seizures shifted the atmosphere immediately. Inside a bedroom closet, investigators located narcotics pressed and colored to resemble legitimate prescription pills, packaged in labeled containers and stacked with care. In a nearby storage area, unprocessed powder was found in bulk, bagged and separated, indicating preparation for further distribution rather than personal use. The materials were not hidden hastily, they were stored as inventory. Cash followed next. Bundles were discovered across multiple rooms, tucked behind furniture and inside common household items, not centralized in one location, but spread out to reduce risk. The pattern was deliberate, suggesting experience with law enforcement pressure rather than fear of it. As agents continued, false identification documents surfaced, each bearing different names and photos, pointing to controlled movement and layered anonymity. Firearms were recovered shortly after, secured but accessible, positioned as tools of enforcement and protection rather than collectibles. Every item appeared placed with intent, reinforcing the sense that this location functioned as a node within a larger operation. As evidence was cataloged and photographed, the focus narrowed toward a single figure. Intelligence already gathered began to align with what was found on site, identifying Ahmed Hassan Noor as the central suspect connected to the seized materials. That identification shifted the operation from a property-based search into a person-driven case, immediately raising its priority and scope. The situation escalated further as background checks and investigative links surfaced a distant family connection to Ilhan Omar. That detail alone altered the trajectory of the case. What had started as a controlled narcotics raid now carried political gravity, drawing attention far beyond the building itself. Investigators understood that the evidence inside these apartments would no longer be evaluated solely on criminal grounds, but through a national lens shaped by public trust and institutional scrutiny. From that moment, the case moved out of the boundaries of a routine enforcement action. Digital devices, prior surveillance data, and online activity were flagged for deeper review, signaling that social media and public perception would soon intersect with the investigation. The operation inside the apartment complex had revealed more than drugs and weapons. It had exposed proximity to influence, and that proximity ensured the consequences would extend well beyond the morning's arrests. This was the point where the story broke open. When narcotics trafficking, political association, and online amplification converge within a single operation, outcomes rarely remain contained. This was where the story broke open. Drugs, political proximity, and online exposure had collided, pushing the case beyond containment. What mattered next was not what had been seized, but what the investigation would reveal beneath the surface. What the early raids exposed was only the visible edge of a process that had been unfolding quietly for nearly 11 months. Long before doors were secured and evidence bags filled, federal investigators had already mapped the outline of a network that did not announce itself with violence or noise. It moved slowly, blended into routine life, and relied on repetition rather than spectacle. That patience shaped the investigation from the start. Surveillance came first, not dramatic tailing, but steady observation of patterns. Vehicles were noted arriving and leaving at consistent hours, short visits that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Apartments that appeared ordinary began to show rhythms that did not match daily living, with brief exchanges and controlled access. The objective was never to rush an arrest. It was to understand behavior over time, to see how people moved when they believed no one was watching. From there, investigators introduced controlled buys, small and deliberate, designed to confirm what surveillance suggested without alerting the broader operation. These transactions were limited in scope and spaced carefully apart, not to build immediate charges, but to verify supply chains and reliability. Each interaction added another data point, reinforcing the sense that this was not a street-level group reacting to demand, but a structured operation responding to internal direction. Financial tracking completed the picture. Analysts followed deposits that appeared modest in isolation, but consistent in frequency. Money entered accounts, exited quickly, and reappeared elsewhere, divided into amounts designed to avoid triggering automated alerts. Cash withdrawals matched the timing of drug movements, linking physical distribution with financial flow. What became clear was that the money did not circulate within a single city. It moved outward, crossing state lines and leaving the country in fragments, each transfer small enough to seem harmless on its own. As these streams converged, the scale widened. Distribution routes extended across multiple states, connecting urban centers that shared little on the surface, but were tied beneath by logistics and payment schedules. Safe locations served as temporary staging points rather than permanent hubs, allowing inventory to shift before pressure could build. The network's strength lay in dispersion, not concentration, making it resilient to isolated disruptions. At this stage, the investigation changed character. The focus was no longer on identifying one suspect or proving one offense. The data showed coordination that could not be explained by individual ambition alone. Roles were defined, tasks repeated, and contingencies built into daily operations. The true adversary was not a person, but a system, one that replaced individuals as needed and continued moving regardless of who was removed. That realization marked the first true breakpoint. What had begun as a case bound by narrow targets and limited objectives, expanded into a federal campaign. Agencies aligned resources, timelines were adjusted, and the goal shifted from prosecution alone to dismantlement. The emphasis moved from proving guilt to breaking function, from closing files to collapsing infrastructure. This was the moment when enforcement turned strategic. The transition carried weight beyond the investigation itself. A network capable of moving narcotics and money across state and national boundaries posed risks that extended past public health and local crime. Its proximity to ordinary neighborhoods and institutions placed it uncomfortably close to daily American life. Allowing it to persist would mean accepting that organized systems could operate undetected within reach of campuses, communities, and financial channels. By the time the coordinated actions were authorized, the groundwork was already complete. The investigation had done its job by revealing how the pieces fit together and where pressure would matter most. What followed would not be an escalation for its own sake, but a calculated response built on months of observation and analysis. This was the point where the story crossed its first irreversible line. The surface had been scratched, but the structure beneath was only beginning to show. Stay with military power, because what comes next exposes just how deep that structure ran. At just after 7 a.m., the operation moved from preparation into execution. The timing was deliberate, morning routines were underway, traffic patterns were predictable, and targets were most likely to be in place. Across the city and beyond it, multiple teams received the same signal within seconds of each other. What followed was not a chase or a standoff, but a synchronized strike designed to overwhelm the network's ability to react. The first location was the apartment complex already under pressure from earlier actions. This time, the objective was not discovery, but closure. Teams entered with clear tasking, securing remaining occupants, locking down storage areas, and ensuring nothing could be moved or destroyed. Rooms were cleared in parallel, evidence collected in sequence, and exits controlled without disruption. The building was neutralized as an operational space in minutes. Its role within the network effectively ended. At the same moment, a second team hit a warehouse several miles away. From the outside, it blended into its surroundings, indistinguishable from dozens of other industrial spaces that serviced ordinary commerce. Inside, however, the purpose was unmistakable. Investigators moved quickly past front offices and into secured work areas, where equipment used for drug processing was laid out with efficiency rather than secrecy. Mixing tools, packaging materials, and measuring devices were positioned for repeated use, indicating production rather than storage. Further inside the warehouse, agents recovered handwritten notes and printed documents outlining distribution routes that reached far beyond the state. City names appeared again and again, forming a loose but consistent map of movement across the country. These were not theoretical plans. Quantities, timing, and handoff points were listed with the kind of precision that only comes from routine execution. The warehouse was not an endpoint. It was a junction, designed to feed multiple markets while remaining invisible in plain sight. While those spaces were being secured, a third team moved on a residential property in a quiet suburban area. The setting could not have been more different. Lawns were trimmed, driveways empty, and neighboring houses showed no sign of unusual activity. Yet this location played a critical role in keeping the entire system alive. Inside, investigators encountered a setup focused not on drugs, but on money. The individual operating there was responsible for managing proceeds, and the methods reflected careful calculation. Financial records showed repeated small deposits, timed to avoid scrutiny, and spread across accounts. Transfers moved outward in stages, passing through intermediaries before leaving the country. Devices used to track balances and schedules were kept close at hand, suggesting constant oversight rather than passive involvement. This was not a courier or a bystander. It was a control point for the network's financial bloodstream. Across all three sites, the defining feature of the operation was precision. There were no dramatic confrontations, no drawn-out negotiations, and no reliance on force beyond what was necessary to maintain control. Each team knew its objective, executed it, and moved on. By striking multiple nodes at once, investigators denied the network the chance to adapt. No warnings traveled ahead. No assets were shifted in time. The structure absorbed the blow in its entirety. The scale of the action became clear as reports from each location converged. Evidence was secured, suspects were detained, and operational spaces were rendered unusable. The network's ability to move product, manage funds, and coordinate distribution was disrupted in a single morning. This was not a symbolic action. It was a functional shutdown, achieved through timing and coordination rather than spectacle. What made this phase decisive was not what was seized, but what was stopped. Routes were cut. Communication chains were broken. Financial pathways were exposed and frozen. The operation demonstrated how federal coordination can compress months of investigation into minutes of irreversible impact. By acting everywhere at once, the agencies involved ensured that no single location could compensate for the loss of another. When the final clearances were given and teams began to withdraw, the outcome was already evident. The campaign had achieved its immediate objectives without drawing attention to itself beyond what was unavoidable. The network had not been chased into the open. It had been closed in on, measured, and taken apart where it stood. This was the payoff of the investigation's first breakpoint. The system that once operated quietly across states and borders had been forced into the light and stripped of its working parts. Yet even as the sites fell silent, the operation was not considered complete. What remained lay not in buildings or equipment, but in data, records, and consequences that would continue to unfold. When the coordinated actions ended, the scenes they left behind were almost unnervingly quiet. The same hallways that had seen controlled movement hours earlier now stood empty, doors sealed, lights still humming as if nothing had happened. Outside, suspects were escorted into vehicles one by one, hands restrained, heads down, moved without drama or resistance. Evidence was boxed, labeled, and loaded methodically, each item treated not as a trophy, but as a fragment of a much larger puzzle. The energy of the operation had drained away, leaving behind stillness and unanswered questions. That silence marked the transition into a different phase. The visible action had concluded, but it was clear to everyone involved that the raids themselves were only the surface. What mattered now was what had been collected and how those pieces would be used. The buildings were no longer the focus. The investigation moved indoors, into rooms filled with screens, cables, and long tables crowded with devices. Laptops were powered on and isolated, phones placed into controlled environments, and handwritten ledgers spread open under bright lights. Each object carried its own story, incomplete on its own but revealing in combination. Teams of analysts and cyber specialists worked in shifts, extracting data, restoring deleted files, and mapping connections that had been deliberately obscured. The pace was relentless, not rushed, driven by the understanding that time favored those who could see the whole picture first. At first, the information appeared scattered. Contact lists led nowhere, transaction logs ended abruptly, and notes referenced places without context. Gradually, patterns began to emerge. Messages aligned with movement timelines already observed during surveillance. Financial entries matched the rhythms of distribution uncovered earlier. Locations that had seemed unrelated started to cluster, forming corridors that linked cities, accounts, and individuals into a coherent structure. This was the moment when scale became unmistakable. What had appeared as a loose arrangement of actors revealed itself as a coordinated network, capable of adapting to pressure by shifting roles and routes. The strength of the operation had never been its secrecy alone, but its design. By spreading risk across locations and functions, it reduced exposure and delayed detection. Yet that same dispersion created a weakness. Once enough data points were connected, the entire system became visible at once. The campaign had struck precisely at that vulnerability. By removing key nodes simultaneously, it forced the network into a position where recovery required coordination it could no longer achieve. Production, distribution, and finance had been separated in theory, but depended on constant alignment in practice. The raids disrupted that alignment, and the data now confirmed it. Without those links, the network could not simply rebuild by replacing individuals. Its architecture had been compromised. As analysts compiled their findings, the focus shifted again. Attention turned inward toward how such a system had operated so close to ordinary life for so long. The question was no longer limited to criminal liability. It extended to oversight, enforcement gaps, and the points at which trust had been assumed rather than verified. This realization marked the second turning point. The investigation was no longer only about dismantling an external threat. It was about examining the spaces that threat had exploited. By the end of this phase, the outlines of a broader reckoning were clear. The evidence did more than explain how the network functioned. It exposed where accountability had weakened, and where corrective action would be unavoidable. The quiet rooms filled with data had revealed more than any single raid ever could, setting the stage for a process that would move beyond arrests and into institutional response. The true consequences of the operation did not appear during the raids themselves. They surfaced afterward, in the days when the noise faded and the details settled into public view. What had been removed was not just a network of drugs and money, but a layer of assumed safety that many people had taken for granted. The realization spread quietly, carrying more weight than any single arrest ever could. What became impossible to ignore was that the threat had not come from outside the community. It had not arrived suddenly or violently from beyond the borders. It had grown within familiar spaces close to schools, apartments, and routines that felt protected by default. The danger was not defined only by criminal ambition, but by access, proximity, and the ability to operate without drawing scrutiny. That recognition changed how the case was understood. Across the affected neighborhoods, reactions followed a similar pattern. There was shock at first, a stunned pause as residents absorbed what had been operating nearby. Conversations stalled. Questions went unanswered. Then came silence, not the calm kind, but the heavy quiet that follows a breach of trust. People spoke less, watched more, and reassessed what they believed about the systems meant to protect them. Confidence did not collapse all at once. It eroded. Images from the aftermath captured that shift more clearly than any statement could. A resident standing outside a cordoned building, arms folded, staring at sealed doors that had once seemed ordinary. A parent guiding a child past flashing lights without explanation. A flag hanging motionless on a porch, no longer a symbol of comfort, but a reminder of responsibility. These moments carried the weight of betrayal and loss, not because violence had occurred, but because faith had been misplaced. Government response followed with a markedly restrained tone. There were no triumphant declarations and no attempt to frame the operation as a victory lap. Officials spoke carefully, acknowledging the seriousness of what had been uncovered and the obligation to address it fully. Announcements focused on oversight, review, and corrective action rather than blame. The message was clear without being loud. Systems had failed, and those failures would be examined. Steps were outlined to restore order and accountability. Internal reviews were initiated, oversight mechanisms reinforced, and monitoring procedures tightened. The emphasis was not on punishment alone, but on repair. Trust, once damaged, could not be demanded back. It had to be rebuilt through transparency and sustained effort. The response signaled that the issue extended beyond one case, requiring structural attention rather than symbolic gestures. As the narrative settled, the nature of the threat was restated with clarity. This had not been a simple matter of drugs moving through a city. It was infiltration that took advantage of assumptions. It was betrayal that relied on familiarity. It was institutional rot that developed slowly where vigilance had softened. These elements combined into a danger far more complex than street crime, because it thrived on invisibility and proximity. The end of this phase arrived without applause. There was no sense of closure, only recognition. What had been exposed demanded reflection before resolution. The work ahead would not be measured in raids or seizures, but in reforms and accountability that unfolded over time. The reckoning was quiet, heavy, and unfinished, setting the stage for the final question that followed. What happens when a system begins to fail from the inside, not with noise or collapse, but with quiet neglect that allows harmful structures to take root? That question now extends far beyond one investigation and far beyond the boundaries of a single community. And this was not only about one city, one group, or one operation. It was a reminder that vulnerabilities do not announce themselves, and that even strong institutions can be tested where attention fades. Across the country, similar conditions exist wherever complexity grows faster than oversight. Criminal networks adapt quickly, shifting methods, locations, and identities to stay ahead of pressure. Systems, by contrast, must be designed not only to respond but to monitor themselves, to recognize weaknesses before they are exploited. The lesson is not that failure is inevitable, but that resilience requires constant effort and correction. This moment calls for more than mere observation from the public. It demands awareness, patience, and support for the agencies protecting both safety and integrity. Their efforts are rarely dramatic, yet essential to preserving trust. Accountability isn't restored by one operation, but by sustained commitment to transparency and vigilance. Value the work that protects communities before threats become crises. Support the federal forces standing that line every day. Like and subscribe to Military Power to stay informed about the operations that shape national security in ways most never see.